So now you may take out the little sheet of paper that looks like this, that's in your bulletin. During these 5 weeks of Lent, we've been doing a little something different with the sermon time. We've been doing more of a teaching sermon. And throughout these weeks, we've been looking at these 4 themes that are the overarching biblical themes in the Bible. Whether you're reading Old Testament or New Testament, the scrolls and books and letters that were selected to go were all ones that people agreed told the story of salvation history. And when you're talking about salvation history, you're talking about these 4 themes. Themes of creation, sin, judgment, and redemption. But because we've heard those words so long, and we usually have very narrow ways that we look at them, it's important to remember that the biblical themes meant a lot more than just the narrow ways that we look at these words. So I've written underneath each sort of a brief word or two that kind of lets you know more about what that theme's talking about. For example, the theme of creation that runs through the Bible is not just about the world was created in so many days and all of that. That has really just such a small part. And as I said before, was a story told not to tell how the world was created, but to tell that it was created by God to be good. And so the intention, the theme of creation is about God's intention for the goodness of the whole universe. And that intention is one that the whole universe would be in harmony with itself, with God. That people would be in harmony with their true selves and with each other and with all creation. And so the theme of creation running throughout the Bible is that God intends this for us. However, we tend to break that intent. And that is the theme that we call sin. Humankind's tendency to break the goodness and the harmony that God intends. Whether we do that intentionally or unintentionally. Because when we break the harmony, even when we don't mean to, it's still broken. And so that leads to a situation that something needs to be done about the brokenness, which leads to the 3rd theme that runs throughout the salvation history, and that's the theme of God's judgment, which, as I've said before, is better understood in more of a body metaphor than a courtroom metaphor. If something's broken about your body, you don't need to be sentenced to something, do you? What do you need if something's broken about your body? What do you need? Pardon? Awareness, healing. You need awareness and healing. Before you can get the healing, you need the awareness. And so that's where the judgment comes in. That God's judgment is God's mercy, God's way of waking us up to what is broken. And it happens in different ways. It may happen through somebody telling us something's broken. It may happen to us hitting bottom and getting to a point where we just realize we need help and we need healing. It happens sometimes in just sort of an aha, that we sort of realize something in our lives is broken and needs to be addressed. It comes in many, many different ways, but that's the theme that runs through the whole biblical story of times when the people are made aware of their own brokenness. And once you're aware of brokenness, then you have an opportunity to change, to be transformed. And that's where the theme of redemption comes in. That the redemption becomes whatever heals that brokenness, whatever helps to restore the goodness and harmony that God intends. And so those themes run throughout the story of Scripture, and they run throughout the story of our lives. And part of the reason we read Scripture is to see how those themes work so that we can better see how they work in our own lives, how God intends for our lives to be led in harmony with ourselves, with others, with God, with all creation, and how things come up. Either from outside or inside of us, and that harmony gets broken, and how God acts in our lives to use other people or our own sense of ourselves to wake up to the brokenness, and then hopefully open ourselves to what kind of healing can restore us. So what we've been doing is taking that overriding thing and then looking at the gospel lessons for each Sunday and seeing how those themes are there in those lessons. And this one is that wonderful story about Jesus with the Samaritan woman at the well. And one of the first things that we need to understand about that is the barriers that were up between Samaritans and Jews. The story hints at it, but the barriers were up after 500 years or more of disagreement. all the stories that we have in the Bible about the fighting between Jacob's sons are really stories about fighting among the 12 tribes of Israel. And so Samaria was an area that was thought to have descended from a certain couple of tribes, while Judea was from something else. And so that starts some of the rivalry. And then during the exile, you get more things that happen that start the rivalry. Till the time of Jesus, 500 years later, they really pretty well hate each other. If a Jew goes into Samaria, he's likely to be killed. And if a Samaritan comes into Judean territory, there's a good chance he or she will be killed. There were riots, there were things where they were destroying each other's temples, there were murders, there were all sorts of things. So when I say barrier, I don't mean just calm disagreements. I mean really like what's going on today in the Middle East, that kind of fighting. So you've got to understand that. That is behind this when Jesus, A, is where he shouldn't be. In Samaria, at one of their holy places, which is this well. That is supposed to have been given by their ancestor Jacob, his ancestor Jacob also, our ancestor Jacob. And he speaks to this woman. And that's not really well done. I mean, in that time, a single man and a single woman unchaperoned really shouldn't be carrying on a conversation. And there's something else that's a little odd, because the woman's at the well at noon. And people usually would come early in the morning and late in the evening. So obviously she is trying to miss the crowds. And there's something about her probably that she's being put down or shunned by them. And so she's having to kind of sneak and get her water at another time of day. Now we've liked to teach this as if she's some bad adulterer because of the husband thing. But it's important to realize that there is a story about Jesus with an adulteress. And he tells the woman who was caught in adultery to go and sin no more. If you read this story over, that's not there. He doesn't tell her to go and sin no more. So it's highly likely that she was not an adulteress. It's highly likely that she had 5 husbands. Maybe they died and she was left a widow. And now she had to be with some man that wasn't even related to her to seek protection. It may be that she was barren and the husbands divorced her because of her barrenness, which they could do in that time. Either one of those would have given her a stigma and be a reason for people to shun her. But it's important to realize we don't know what it is about her. It's just that somehow Jesus knows her and is able to show her how much he knows her in a way that's healing for her. And she realizes in that moment with Jesus that all the barriers all the barriers that come down. The barriers that should have divided them as Jew and Samaritan in that conversation with Jesus have come down. The barriers that should have divided them as a single woman and a single man have come down. The barriers that divided her from her own village have come down. And Jesus tells her in that moment that there will come a time when these barriers don't mean a thing anymore. A time when it won't matter where people worship, because we'll worship in spirit and truth. And to worship in spirit and truth is to understand the reality that God has created us to be one. You know, it's said, and I don't know which space flight this was, I think it was early on, but it was said when some of the astronauts went up in one of the space flights. Afterwards, one of them noted that when you look back down on Earth, you don't see boundaries between nations. You just see one planet. God's intent is that we all will be one. In fact, it's a prayer that runs throughout the Gospel of John where Jesus continues to pray that we will be one as God is one. So that's the intent. It gets broken by human barriers. It gets broken by the fact that we can't agree on how to govern ourselves, that we can't agree on how to worship, that we can't agree on what's right or what's wrong in ways of people acting out their lives together. We get all these barriers, but the barriers aren't God's intent. The barriers are the human brokenness. And so the judgment, the awareness comes when we see that brokenness, when we see that our divisions are causing something that needs to be healed. And the redemption comes when we begin to make steps to help take down the barriers. Now, there are lots of examples I can give about that. There are probably lots of examples you're thinking about. I mean, I think about Doctors Without Borders and the way that they participate in that redemption, regardless of where you are. If you need a doctor, they will go. I mean, that's an incredible example. I think about some of the interfaith dialogues where people are trying to understand, where Christians are trying to understand Jews better, and Jews are trying to understand Christians better, and we're trying to understand Muslims better, and we're realizing that in this world we've got to at least be able to talk and understand it. It's there. But you know, it's been there in Christianity too. Barriers between Christian group and Christian group. We may not be murdering each other, as happens in some countries, or as happened in Jesus' day between the Samaritans and the ones that thought they were pure Jews, but we still have barriers between Christian and Christian. And every now and then something happens that shows the effect of the brokenness, because God doesn't intend us to have these barriers. God intends us to be one. Maybe not the same. You know, because when we talk about trees being one, trees are very different. It'd be really kind of boring if they were all pine trees, you know. But we know instinctively an oak tree is no less a tree than a pine tree is, and it's fine to have them both. Okay, so God's intent is for us to be healed in that. And one of the ways that happens is through dialogue, through conversation, and through groups that are divided, realizing that maybe there are areas they can come together. This happened in the Episcopal Church, over 30 years of conversation. Finally, in 2001, an agreement was formed with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. 30 years of conversations about this before they actually were the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, when they were still just the Lutheran Church in America. 30 years of conversation. In 2001, an agreement for full communion. An agreement to realize that there was a brokenness in two bodies that really pretty much did things very similar and believed very similarly, that there was no reason for that brokenness to exist. And so in 2001, this agreement was formed where priests and pastors could be exchanged. An Episcopal church could call a Lutheran pastor, a Lutheran church could call an Episcopal priest. A member of a Lutheran church could just start attending an Episcopal church and be as much a member as if they were the member of the Lutheran church. A way of healing and yet preserving the integrity. So that you see those themes throughout there, that God's intent, the brokenness, the awareness of the brokenness, and then attempts that we still do today for that healing. And I bring that up for a specific reason. Because we have an opportunity today to participate in the healing part of brokenness between two Christian denominations and the healing part of what it means to share in communion with each other. And there's some very specific conversations that are going on about that now between us and the Lutheran Church that have just started. And I'm going to ask our senior warden, Bob Ray, to pretty much close my sermon out by telling you specifically about where we are and what we have been talking about. And I'd like you to hear it within those four themes of realizing that this is not just something that happens to happen, but is a part of participation in that redemptive healing that is part of God's plan.
As Mother Gayle said, about a month ago, we actually approached individuals at the Lutheran Church and to start conversations regarding the concept of sharing Mother Gayle as a priest, as a collective priest between both of our congregations. The Lutheran Church right now has an interim priest. He lives in Groveport, and he spends Sundays and Wednesdays in Washington Courthouse. And they have a temporary agreement with him. So they were somewhat interested in that, but didn't really know. They have what they call council, which is the equivalent of our vestry. And they report to what is called the Southern Ohio synod, which is the same as Sidon, which is the same as our diocese, Southern Diocese. So they have a bishop and they have an assistant bishop. Last Monday, their bishop and assistant bishop met with their council here in Washington Courthouse and had a meeting to discuss where they were relative to their search for a priest and what they were going to do, what their strategy was going to be. Jack Kepke, who is the canon, our canon, the Southern Ohio Diocese, Episcopal Diocese, he had already had a conversation with the Lutheran bishop regarding Washington Courthouse. And they both very much support, in fact, both the diocese and the Lutheran support this concept. The local people at the Lutheran Church did not know that, so when both the bishop and the assistant bishop brought that up in their meeting last Monday as a positive thing, they were very excited. And as a result, we got a call back on Tuesday, actually, with interest to meet. And that's going to happen on the 3rd of April, where Mother Gayle will meet, our vestry will meet, the Lutheran Council will meet, then there will be the assistant bishop in attendance. Jeff Wick is his name, and representing our diocese will be Lynn Carter Edmonds, and she is the canon for formation and transition, so this is her area of responsibility. So that will be the next event, to just discuss conceptually what that would look like. I did want to read a phrase. Jack Kemke sent me an email, and he is, to show his support of this, he said it, I think, more eloquently than I could. He said, "The possibility of creating a common ministry that preserves the distinctiveness of each tradition shows great promise." So we are getting, I would say, extreme support from both the Lutheran and the Episcopal side. So I'm very anxious that this could solve an issue that both churches have in Washington Courthouse. Our vestry is going to meet next Sunday, which is a week early, to basically discuss and prepare for our meeting on the 3rd. And we will be back to you after these events to tell you how we're getting along, what the details are. I will also tell you that now the Lutherans at their Sunday worship service today, they are communicating to their parish the same thing, that these discussions are occurring. So you may hear something about this, and if you have any questions, please feel free to see a vestry member or call me. I'd be happy to communicate where we are. But we're in the preliminary stages, and I think everyone is very excited about the opportunity that exists. Thank you.
And so salvation history goes on.